Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, August 27th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the 2026 Senate race in the state of Texas. Now, a recent poll that was acquired by the press, Colin Allred's firm that he works with, did a poll across the state of Texas between Ken Paxton and Colin Allred in the 2026 Senate election in the state of Texas, so showing that Colin Allred is in a shockingly close position in the state ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. Now, what this data is presenting us is a very interesting potential matchup, and one that requires a lot of different things to be done in order for this to be the case and reality that comes forth to us in November of 2026. Now, before this video really does get started, I want to note that this is a Democratic internal poll. That is the nature of any poll that is conducted or sponsored by a political campaign, and often these polling firms are incentivized to come with numbers back that make races more competitive. And so I want to say that the Texas Senate race, from the very beginning, I've maintained this, and I maintain it throughout the entirety of this video. Republicans do have the advantage. But polling can only do so much. I don't think they fabricated these data points, and I certainly don't think that they're lying about the numbers. What I do think they're telling us is that this race is more competitive than ever, and I think there's some very justifiable reasons as to why that might be. Now, the data that we've been getting out of the state of Texas has been a bit wishy-washy for the Republicans. Not amazing, not the worst, but certainly something that favors Democrats more than it does favor Republicans. And that's because right now what we've been seeing is a clear trend line. In the head-to-head polls between Colin Allred, the only announced Democrat, but there's a lot of expectation that other Democrats enter into this race, and John Cornyn and Ken Paxton, the two very prominent, John Cornyn is the incumbent Republican senator, Ken Paxton is the incumbent attorney general, hoping to challenge John Cornyn. The races here show that John Cornyn does perform better than Ken Paxton in head-to-head races against candidates like Colin Allred. And the reason for that, it seems, is that John Cornyn is less scandal-plagued and wins over more moderate voters, as he does have a track record of outperforming and outpacing the national GOP candidates. In 2020, he outperformed Donald Trump. In 2012, he outpaced Mitt Romney. So the margins here for John Cornyn have been more impressive. But the problem for the Texas GOP, we talked about this, how the Republican Party of Texas's own biggest enemy might be their own political party. The most recent data from Echelon Insights shows that Ken Paxton has a 5-point lead over the incumbent John Cornyn, who's been in office for over a decade. If the incumbent senator has been here and voters know him but they don't love him, chances are he's not winning that primary. And so if Ken Paxton, who's the front runner right now on the GOP side, does in fact win the nomination for Senate, the Senate race in Texas is going to look a lot closer, and the numbers here clearly show that. Even if you're not taking a look at the Democratic internal poll, which I think is, something, but it doesn't mean everything, Emerson College has this race within 5 points, with 13% of the electorate that says, I'm plainly put, just undecided. Amongst John Cornyn against him, John Cornyn doesn't receive as overwhelming and enthusiastic support, another hurdle that Cornyn would have to tackle, but I still think he's by far the more electable Republican. Colin Allred also doesn't receive as much of a firm opposition to a hypothetical John Cornyn candidacy from voters in Texas, indicating that there certainly are voters out there that, when faced with the reality of going up against Ken Paxton, lockstep behind the Democratic nominee, even if they weren't necessarily willing to do so against John Cornyn. And thinking about why Republicans are so worried about Ken Paxton in this race, well, he has a lot of baggage. In 2023, Ken Paxton was impeached by the Republican majority in the Texas House. His wife, State Senator Angela Paxton, bailed him out in the state Senate by whipping all the votes against his conviction, saved him from removal from office. And now they're getting a divorce. Now, not something that seems to have taken a huge hit to his Senate bid in the state of Texas. While he was leading by more before, he's still leading. It's not a great place to be if you're John Cornyn, because he's been the incumbent for such a long time and is out fundraising and outspending Ken Paxton. Ultimately, Paxton has the visibility. Because a lot of the MAGA base views John Cornyn as a rhino, a Republican in name only. And they see Ken Paxton as someone who really does leverage the authority that he has according to Texas state law, and in some cases, his own interpretation of Texas state law. But thinking about an inevitable general election between a Democratic candidate, keep in mind, Colin Allred outpaced Kamala Harris in the last cycle by 7. But there's also a wide range of candidates, too, who could very well run. Joaquin Castro, Beto O'Rourke, James Tallarico, a long list of Democrats that head-to-head against Ken Paxton could very well give him a run for his money. Now, Republicans are coming off Texas in the last presidential cycle with Donald Trump winning the state by 14 points, which means that Republicans do undoubtedly have the upper hand. But the Texas Republicans have been pushing their luck recently. They decided to pass a brand new congressional map in the state of Texas, which voters do not love in the state, nor do they on the national level. It's causing a lot of controversy with the GOP, not only within the state, but again, also spread all across this nation. And taking a look at the 2018 Senate elections, it was in fact states that voted for Donald Trump by massive margins that were still willing to vote for Democrats in the Senate races if they had strong candidates. For instance, Ohio, a state Donald Trump won by 8, Sherrod Brown won by 6. That's about a 14-point swing, which is the exact necessary numbers the Democrats would need to win in a state like Texas. In West Virginia and Montana we'll start with because it was a closer margin. Donald Trump won the state by 21 points. John Tester wins it by 3.5. In the state of West Virginia, Donald Trump won the state by 40 points. Joe Manchin wins it by about 3 points. Massive, massive swings. And that isn't to say that I think that Democrats will in fact win in the state of Texas, but do I believe this race would be competitive with Ken Paxton at the top? 1,000%. Because he's a chronic underperformer and even was an underperformer before this impeachment came forth before the voters. Voters don't like Republicans who other Republicans had to say, you need to go. He was in this position and was charged with a number of different things that resulted in the state house saying, even though it is a massive Republican advantage, they very clearly knew, at least voted in the way, that they believed he was guilty, and did so in a way that made it very difficult and makes it very difficult for him to shake that reputation. And even if the Texas GOP falls behind him and endorses him in this election, which they very well may, the amount of support he would receive, I think, pales in comparison to what John Cornyn would do. As someone who has historically outpaced Donald Trump in multiple elections, we're going to find that he's outpaced the Republican nominee for president in the previous cycle. If he's able to outperform Donald Trump's 14-point margin, Republicans are set. Now, I still think that Texas will narrow up because 2026 is a good year for the Democratic Party, and their generic ballot numbers are starting to improve and starting to look a lot better. But when it comes down to Texas in particular, while Democrats may be the underdogs, they're finding that independents, when faced with the option of Colin Allred, who they knew from the last cycle, and Ken Paxton, who they dislike from this cycle, Colin Allred wins by 32 points amongst independent voters and Hispanic voters as well. And amongst voters who say they definitely are voting in 2026, Allred leads by 5. Again, I don't think Allred wins this race right now. But to think that maybe we could see Democrats come close, I think is closer to reality in 2026 than it is and was in 2024. Because running alongside the same ballot as a presidential ticket, especially in hindsight, when you see that, Colin Allred lost by single digits, but Kamala Harris lost by 14 in the state, massive, massive difference there. And a lot of that was inspired by Allred's campaign and Ted Cruz's unpopularity. But Ken Paxton and Ted Cruz are not comparable. They're not comparable candidates. Ted Cruz is exceptionally stronger, and that's saying something as someone who almost lost his Senate race in 2018. Almost lost his Senate race. That is also the point, too. But Ken Paxton, a whole nother ballgame. And so I think it's going to be really something to see how this primary unfolds, whether or not Donald Trump gets involved, because believe it or not, Republicans are aware, too, that their own base might choose Ken Paxton. But that would require a strong general election advantage that Ken Paxton simply cannot offer. And now thinking about where Democrats are across this country, where they are in terms of Republicans are in this state, they're not in a great position, ultimately speaking. They're looking at it and saying that we should be able to win by X, Y, and Z. But no, that's not the case. You're not going to win just because you believe you're going to win. Republicans still need to fight for it. It's not the easiest thing to see. This is a very competitive race that Republicans are going to have to deal with and realize that maybe it's not going to be in a position where it's as clear-cut as you think. Maybe it's not going to be in a position where this dynamic between Ken Paxton and Colin Albright is as easy as it was between Ted Cruz, because Ted Cruz was a very different candidate who arguably manicured himself over the past few cycles. And so Paxton, I think, just provides a unique vulnerability that this data is exposing. Provides a very difficult position for the GOP that they never even should have to worry about in the first place. Texas should never be the state the GOP has to spend money on, that the GOP has to look at, that the GOP has to focus by any metric on. It's a very large state with very expensive media markets and a state that they have historically been able to rely on time and time again. But with Ken Paxton, that may no longer happen. And although I do think Republicans will pull through and will win the Texas Senate race, I simultaneously am in full understanding that Texas itself sometimes can swing, and sometimes by pretty massive amounts. So keep your eyes peeled in the state of Texas. We'll see who decides that they want to enter in and out of the race, and as we get more data, I will update you. And while Republicans hold this advantage, Texas will be of unique interest, hopefully to you, and certainly to me. And we'll be talking about it over the next year and a half, especially as a hyper-competitive GOP primary and likely Democratic primary unfolds in the United States' second largest state. With a lot at stake on the line in 2026, Texas might be at the forefront of it come next November. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.